Welcome back, everybody. Paul Kengor, Center for Vision and Values at Grove City College, which is a proud sponsor of Glen Meakem on the weekend. And I'm here filling in for Glen. Glen has taken a break. We're doing a special full 2-hour show just on the American founding. This badly needs to be done given the state of education in America today, from our K through 12 to our universities, which I think are probably even worse than the public schools. So here we are, and I've got with me next Joe Postell. Joe is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. He teaches courses on American institutions, political parties, American political philosophy. Prior to joining the faculty at Colorado, he was Assistant Director of the B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles and Politics at the Heritage Foundation. A great group, and in fact, I met Joe there. He did tremendous work, and Joe has been on this show, too. The last time I hosted her, the time before we had him on. Joe Postell has published many articles in scholarly journals, popular publications, newspapers, Washington Times, National Review, Claremont Review of Books. His first book is an edited volume titled Rediscovering Political Economy. Rediscovering Political Economy. So, Joe, how are you doing? Good to have you back.
I'm doing well, Paul. Thanks for inviting me to be on the show.
Sure. Now, we wanted to talk to you about a couple of things. We're going to do this over 2 segments. I wanted to ask you about the Federalist Papers, and then also following that, maybe in the next segment, a little bit about how American progressives have invoked the founding, interpreted, maybe misinterpreted, applied, misapplied the founding. But so start first with the Federalist Papers. Tell us why did they come about? What necessitated the Federalist Papers? What year were they introduced, and by whom?
Yeah, great. The Federalist, it was really written in response to opponents of the Constitution. So after the convention, the Constitutional Convention is over, the Constitution is written and signed in September of 1787. The question becomes, is it going to be ratified? Mm-hmm. And obviously the founders don't just hand this down to the people as if they're supposed to adopt it without question, but they say, here's a plan, and it's only going to be enacted if you ratify it, government by consent of the government. So the question became, is this plan going to be adopted? And it actually didn't look very good at first. Mm-hmm. Several states that absolutely needed to sign, you could have gotten the requisite 9 states out of the 13 states, but if states like New York, Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania weren't part of that group, it wasn't going to fly. And so the Anti-Federalists, they were the ones to first actually write against the Constitution in newspapers. And so they sort of beat the Federalists a punch. They got the war of words going, but they got the first shots in. And so the Federalist was this plan that Alexander Hamilton put together to write all of these responses to the Anti-Federalists. And he got James Madison to join him, and then John Jay wrote a handful of the essays, but it's primarily Madison and Hamilton who were responsible for them.
Well, and now prior to the Constitution, so this is like 1787, there had been an Articles of Confederation, right? And right. That hadn't worked. That was around 1781. And
it was just after 1776. Independence is declared, and
sure.
Then the Articles of Confederation are in place between the Declaration and the Constitutional Convention. But it's really completely inadequate, and almost caused, I think, sort of the end of the experiment in America for self-government, really on its own. It was just not an adequate form of government.
So in 1787, then, 3 of our would-be founders, Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, they come together and they write these papers. Now you get them in a book, but they didn't come out in a book. They came out, more almost like articles or arguments in newspapers?
Yeah, this is great, and I always tell my students this, that they're addressed to the people of New York. Every single one of them is addressed to the people of New York, and they're published in New York newspapers. So I'll always assign the Federalist Papers in my classes, and my students will say, we can't read this, it's too difficult, and I tell them, if you were a normal, average citizen in New York at the time of the founding, you would have been expected to read and understand. So this just shows, as you were saying at the opening here, kind of the decline in the educational system, that we aren't preparing students to read these arguments.
Well, and weren't they all signed by Publius?
Yeah, right. Publius is the pseudonym that's used. They all like to use pseudonyms back, during this period. That way you focused on the argument, not on the person who's writing. In a way, I think we could be better off if we did some of that today, because as soon as you see the name on an article, you tend to judge it based on who's writing. Mm-hmm. They wanted to avoid that, focus on the argument, not the person, and so that's why they use these pseudonyms.
Well, now, the mastermind behind the idea then of the Federalist Papers, it was mainly Hamilton, right?
Right.
Did he get it going?
Yeah, he was largely the sort of coordinator, and he wrote the majority of the essays. There are 85 in total. There's a lot of dispute about who wrote which ones. We know that 5 of them were written by John Jay. Around 50, maybe 51, were written by Hamilton, and then, I think 35 or so by Madison. My contention is, though, that Madison wrote the best of them. So it's not about quantity, but quality, and Madison's responsible, I think, for some of the best ones, some of the best essays.
Which one, the Federalist 10, do you have favorites?
I really do. And what most scholars focus on is Federalist number 10, which talks about if we have a very large republic instead of a small one, we can overcome factional disputes by extending the republic and bringing in more factions so that they balance each other out. And then Federalist 51, which is really about the separation of powers. My personal favorites are Federalist 49, which is about this argument whether we should have a constitutional convention every 19 years. Madison replies that would be a really bad idea because we need to have veneration for the Constitution. It's Jefferson's idea that...
Why 19 years?
Write its own. Jefferson had he concocted this idea that it's unjust for any generation of people to bind another generation of people. So if we're living by a constitution that a previous generation came up with, we are not governed ourselves. And so every generation should rewrite its own constitution. And he calculated this out very mathematically and came up with 19 years is when a new generation comes into being. So this was sort of typical Jefferson and Madison. I think typically he was very deferential to Jefferson, and Jefferson was his mentor, but he thought this was one of the worst ideas Jefferson ever had. And Madison got the better of the argument on that one.
Well, and now didn't Jefferson also make the comment, Joe, about what a crime it is to burden the next generation with the debts of the current generation?
Yeah, and Jefferson was right on a lot of things and wrong on a lot of things. He was one of the most interesting founders because he spent some time in France, and my contention would be that his experience in France ruined him to some extent.
Well, that's happened many times before. And after.
Right. And, that's just the ideas of the French Revolution, which obviously end very violently, are in Jefferson's mind. And there's that quote you often hear about the tree of liberty must be, fertilized with the blood of tyrants.
Yes.
Citizens, that's its natural manure. These are the kinds of things that were being said in France a lot, and they filtered their way into Jefferson's thinking.
Well, and in France, they did turn citizens into manure. I mean, the literal flow of blood from the guillotine. And some people think I took a cheap shot at France there, but, I mean, Marx and Engels met in France. 8 of the 9 core members of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia were in Paris. That's where Pol Pot learned Marxism. Ho Chi Minh learned Marxism. So, I mean, ideas have consequences, and France has been disastrous for manufacturing these radical ideas that are taken up by other countries, tyrants who go on mass killing sprees. It's really cool.
I think you could argue from the perspective of political philosophy that progressivism even comes from France. We look at in Germany, and it obviously, that's sort of the immediate place that it comes from. Wilson and all these American progressives go to Germany and get their PhDs, but a lot of the ideas in Germany, especially from Hegel, you can see the roots of those ideas in Rousseau. So there's the argument to be made that even American liberalism or progressive liberalism in America can be traced back to France.
Well, and for the record, the French Revolution, I had talked about John Adams in setting up our interview. John Adams was very pessimistic about the French Revolution. There's a great quote where he said to Jefferson, who was enthusiastic, but Adams said, "I see no reason to be excited about a revolution of 30 million atheists."
Yeah, that's right.
So, I mean, we had some people in America who were admirers and some who were very fearful of what would happen.
Yeah, it was easy at the time for them to get confused about the French Revolution because it looked, maybe from some perspectives, to be very much like the American. It was a revolution against aristocracy and for democracy, but there were elements of it that were not rooted in natural law. Certainly they got rid of religion, which the founders believed was central to an understanding of natural law. But also they completely rejected the idea of tradition. In fact, they even got rid of the traditional calendar because they thought it was too much rooted in the old, and so they came up with this new calendar. And they got rid of all of the religious elements of the society and came up with the festival of the Supreme Being, which was this sort of deist replacement of religion.
Oh, it was viciously atheistic. Yeah, it was horribly atheistic, anti-God, war on Christianity, de-Christianization. I mean, they changed the 7-day week because it was rooted in biblical belief. I mean, they tried to undo everything. And by the way, since I'm teaching here and I've got the pulpit today, and I'm telling people to take notes, read Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, which is not just a great book about the French Revolution, but a statement on conservatism, and especially the Russell Kirk edition with the intro to it. But we'll be right back. This is Paul Kengor, Center for Vision and Values, filling in for Glen Meakem on the weekend, and I have on the line Joe Postell of the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, talking about the Federalist Papers. We'll pick this up when we come back, and some other thoughts and other things. Everybody, welcome back. Paul Kengor, Center for Vision and Values, Grove City College, proudly standing in for Glen Meakem on the weekend. Glen's taking a break. We're doing a full 2 hours just on the American founding. And I have on the line Joe Postell, who's a professor of political science at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. Prior to that, he had been assistant director at the terrific B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles and Politics at the Heritage Foundation. We broadcast from 104.7. That's the flagship, Glen's flagship out of Pittsburgh, although this show is heard throughout Pennsylvania and several bordering states, Ohio, New York, New Jersey, West Virginia, Maryland, and even in parts of Delaware, I think, probably, Nathan. And, in fact, I heard the show on WHP 580 out of Harrisburg, all the way down to the Beltway in D.C. one time, so it's got quite a reach. But for the folks at the flagship 104.7, B. Kenneth Simon, for whom the center at the Heritage Foundation was named for, was a Pittsburgher, and a great guy, wonderful man. I became good friends with him, and he died several years ago, and he's missed. A good man. But Joe, it's good to have you on. We left off with the Federalist Papers, and basically the purpose of these, you got documents from roughly the year 1788, and the idea is what? Basically to convince or persuade these young United States, these young citizens of this young United States, on the heels of the American Revolution, Declaration of Independence, to convince them to support this new Constitution. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's the immediate intention, although we probably shouldn't overlook that they were writing for later generations as well, and even our own today. They're still writing for us because they devised the greatest Constitution that we've ever been able to live under, human beings have ever lived under, and they wanted to perpetuate that and explain why this Constitution is so great. So yes, they wrote for their own time, but I think they also wrote for ours as well. Yeah, despite the Justice Ginsburg recently recommending, she said we should dig out that clip, Nathan. I know you played it on the show before, where she talks about if she was drafting a Constitution today, she wouldn't recommend the U.S. Constitution. She'd recommend maybe the South African Constitution. and by the way, somebody emailed me and said, I actually dug out the South African Constitution, and it's actually pretty bad. I don't know why you would recommend that at all. But yeah, I mean, Joe, ours has been around for 220 some years.
assimilated the greatest melting pot in human history and turned it into the mightiest economic, military, economic power in history, and taking all different people from nationalities and everything else. It's a wonderful model. And so why is this not necessarily the Constitution, but why are the Federalist Papers? Why do they still matter? Why are they still relevant?
Yeah, I think the relevance really has to do with how deeply we've departed from the wisdom in the Federalist Papers. They're relevant because we've forgotten how to think about our Constitution. We tend to fight these days about particular provisions of the Constitution. So, does the Commerce Clause justify doing X, the individual mandate, or something like that? And if you read the Federalist Papers, I think what strikes you the most, and if you read them carefully from start to finish, you realize that what framers were really focused on were the structural provisions of the Constitution, how the whole thing is structured. And the two things that they really emphasize that I think are relevant today are the principles of republican government as opposed to a democracy, and the principle of the separation of powers.
Could you what is the difference then on republican government versus democracy? We get that question all the time.
Yeah. Well, if you read the Federalist Papers, they have nothing but contempt for democracy. There's a great line in one of the Federalist Papers, it's Federalist 55, where he says, Madison writes, if every Athenian were Socrates, every Athenian democracy would still have been a mob.
Wow.
Doesn't matter, even if you had a bunch of people who were as wise as Socrates, if you put them in a democracy, they would be a mob.
Oh, my.
Because pure democracies always function like a mob. And the republican form of government rests on the idea of representation, that you elect people to represent your interests, particularly in the legislative branch. But the idea of a republican form of government, and Madison's very clear on this in the Federalist, is that all power in government has to be held by an official who's accountable through an election. Now, it could be a direct election, like we directly elect members of the House of Representatives and today the Senate, or it could be indirect, namely we elect the president who then appoints Supreme Court justices. But at some point, government by consent of the governed requires that you have an election to determine who's going to make the law. Now, that seems so reasonable, and it seems like we still follow that today. But if you think about it, what we have today is a form of government where most of the laws are made by administrative agencies. The Environmental Protection Agency sets air quality standards. The FAA sets laws that you have to comply with when you're on an airplane. In other words, the laws aren't really made by Congress today, an elected body. Rather, they're made by administrative officials who are unelected and unaccountable. And if you the truth of that just hits you so obviously that we're governed not by our elected representatives, but by these experts in the recesses of these administrative agencies. We don't know who they are or who voted them in because nobody voted them. And so the simple principle of republicanism, so clearly articulated in the Federalist Papers, has been, I think, basically just thrown in the garbage.
Yes.
In the 20th century. And the same thing holds true for the separation of powers.
Right.
The idea that, these agencies not only make law in the form of rules and regulations, but they investigate, prosecute them, and then they adjudicate them. They have all three powers at the same time. Well, so those basic structural truths in the Federalist have been completely ignored today, and we don't even understand them well enough to defend them, we conservatives.
Well, and now recently when President Obama, when the Supreme Court was first started reviewing whether or not the individual mandate in Obamacare is constitutional, President Obama made that just horrendous statement about what an extraordinary, unprecedented step it would be for the Supreme Court to overturn a law passed by Congress. Right. I mean, and what's so damaging about that is that President Obama's followers have this almost religious-like devotion, many of them, where they don't question anything that the guy says. They know that he went to Harvard, that he was a constitutional law professor, so they hear that and they're thinking, oh, well, those Supreme Court justices are bad if they're going to overturn this, when in fact what he said is absolutely incorrect. And I mean, that's the essence of separation of powers and checks and balances, is that the Supreme Court does have that power, and really this, the whole court case, it had to go to the court because Obamacare forced its hand by issuing something that was of questionable constitutionality.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is why reading the Federalist is so rewarding, because if you read what they say about what Hamilton actually writes about judicial review, he says, yes, it's not explicitly in the Constitution that the Supreme Court should overturn a law that's unconstitutional, but the Supreme Court's duty is to uphold the law, and the higher law is the Constitution. So any law that violates the highest law has to yield. So any ordinary law passed by Congress, namely the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, if it violates the higher law, the fundamental law, the Constitution, then the court has to go with the higher law over the lower law. This is obvious to Hamilton. And apparently not obvious.
No, apparently not. And I've got my copy of the Federalist right here in my lap, and if you go to the index, it says judicial review. It has all sorts of notes, Commerce Clause, all sorts of notes. So what you have here is an addendum almost to the Constitution, where if you're not sure what the Constitution says on something, you can go to the Federalist Papers. And you can do that today over and over again, maybe even on a question like the current Obama, Kathleen Sebelius, HHS mandate on contraception and abortion drugs that the Catholic Church is dealing with.
Right, and if you want to see an example of an agency making a law, there it is.
Yeah.
Right. This is not it's not an execution of the law. It's the making of law.
Yes.
Who's going to execute the law? HHS is going to execute the law that HHS has made. This is just so blatantly a violation of the separation of powers, and these are the kinds of things I think that need to be stated more clearly, that these basic structural principles are at stake.
Well, it's so against the spirit of the Federalist Papers, the Constitution. I mean, Hamilton, Madison, Jay would be rolling over in their graves. I mean, imagine or think about what's going on. People listening. You had a Congress that passed the Patient Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare. Nancy Pelosi will tell you what's in it after it's passed. And then all of a sudden, one day, from the executive branch, from the Department of Health and Human Services, this decree, comes down by presidential fiat that tells religious believers that they have to pay for contraception and abortion drugs, that they don't have a freedom, a conscience exemption, and that's just been determined pretty much unilaterally by the one branch of government, right?
Yeah, it's really the takeover of the constitutional system by administrative agencies. That, whether they're in the executive department like HHS or not, like let's say the Federal Trade Commission, which is technically an independent regulatory commission, it's all the consolidation of power. Instead of the separation of power, today we have the consolidation of it, all in the same hands, so that you can push anything through down the throats of the American people as quickly as possible.
Yeah. Joe Postell, I have a few more minutes, maybe about 3, and it's not enough time for this question, but I'm gonna ask it anyway.
All right.
Now, progressives. Tell us how the progressive movement, historically, 20th century and through today, how they've invoked the Constitution and these documents, and often quite incorrectly, in our opinion.
Yeah, I think with the progressives, what they really stood for was everything that the Constitution stood against. Progressives really just wanted to get the Constitution out of the way. But they couldn't do that openly because the people love the Constitution, and they're not going to elect progressives who say, not so many words, we don't like the Constitution, it's time to scrap it in favor of what we want to do. So they had to come up with an alternative approach, which was say that you love the Constitution, but undermine it at every possible moment.
And they do. They say all the time how much they love it.
Right, but they love their interpretation of it, which is entirely at odds with the original Constitution. Anyone who reads the Federalist can see how different the Progressive Constitution is from theirs. And the greatest example of this is Woodrow Wilson in 1912. When he's giving campaign speeches, he uses this image which is perfect for today. He talks about how the Founders' Constitution is a very Newtonian constitution. And that makes sense to us, right? It's checking and balancing of opposite powers. Very Newtonian, like a machine or like physics. What Wilson said is we have to stop thinking of the Constitution as a Newtonian document. Instead, we have to think of it as a Darwinian document.
Great.
Where it evolves over time. It grows over time into something that it doesn't look like in previous eras. And so what he wants to do, and all progressives want to do, is to interpret the Constitution according to the Darwinian principle of evolution, the living Constitution right there. And so through reinterpreting the Constitution, Wilson says, we'll just make it mean something very different than what the founders intended without actually amending it. So we'll just reinterpret it through judicial opinions, through passing on constitutional laws until they become commonplace, and then the Constitution will mean something completely different than what the founders intended.
Yes.
And that's pretty much what they did over the last 100 years.
All along saying, boy, we love that Constitution.
Right, yeah, because they love the Constitution that they've created through reinterpretation. And that's really what we're dealing with today.
You know, progressives, too, you mentioned the word democracy earlier. They always use that word democracy. John Dewey did it. There's a show I see in my PBS affiliate called Democracy Now! With an exclamation mark. And they're always talking democracy, democracy, democracy. And you had made the distinction between that and Republican government. That's in a way related to this as well.
Yeah, although I will say this. I don't think progressives are coherent when it comes to talking about democracy. Because look at something like Proposition 8 in California, right? Mm-hmm. This is something that a very strong majority of the people of California voted in favor of. And when the court basically got involved and said, we're going to overturn this because we think it's unlawful or it's wrong, the progressives applauded that decision. In other words, they don't really like democracy unless democracy agrees with them.
Yes.
So, if the people elect George W. Bush to 2 consecutive terms, the problem is too much democracy, and the people really don't understand what's good for them. There's a great book by Thomas Frank, an influential progressive, called What's the Matter with Kansas?
Yeah, the New York Times guy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the idea is, if these stupid people in Kansas can't figure out what's best for them, we need experts like progressives to come in and sort of run their lives for them.
Yeah, you need New Yorkers to come in and tell them how to think.
Yeah, and so they say they love democracy, but when you look at them in practice, they only like it when it suits them. Mm-hmm. And I think the same thing, they don't like the Tea Party. If the Tea Party wins Democratic victories, they're going to start talking badly about democracy. And so they're just going to manipulate the system in order to advance the objectives that they're in favor of passing.
Yeah. Let's wrap up. Apply this progressives and the Constitution to Obama today.
Yeah, I think the key thing that we need to look for in terms of applying these principles today is what is Obama doing to advance the rule of law? Right? There's all this stuff with Obamacare and specific issues, but they also seem to trace everything back to one problem, which is that we've abandoned the idea of separating powers and adhering to a normal legal process in the way we conduct ourselves in government. What we've got now is basically a win at any cost, pass anything you can, no matter what process you use, consolidate as much power as you can in the hands of the person you trust, kind of government. And that, in the long run, will do much more damage than any specific policy, because we'll get rid of the very institutions that promote the rule of law and protect liberty.
Joe Postell, great stuff. Thank you so much for joining us. We got to cut out and go to a break. Take care. Thanks.
Hey, thank you for having me.
This is Paul Kengor filling in for Glen Meakem, and we'll be back in a couple of minutes.